Welcome to the CATAPULT Lockdown Virtual Salon program. This afternoon, I'll be in discussion with Stephanie Leitch from Trinidad and Tobago. Before we begin, I'd like to express huge thanks to the CATAPULT partners, including the American Friends of Jamaica, Kingston Creative, and Fresh Milk, for making this series of salons happen. Please feel free to ask your questions in the comments section during the talk, which will get to the Q&A segment of the salon, and subscribe to the Fresh Milk YouTube channel. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Raquel Paiewonsky. I am a visual artist from the Dominican Republic, where I also live and work. Today, I am very pleased to be speaking with Stephanie Leitch from Trinidad and Tobago. Stephanie Leitch is a fierce feminist organizer, LGBTQ plus advocate, and nonprofit leader from Trinidad and Tobago. In 2011, she founded the digital platform WOMANTRA, which remains the premier hub for Caribbean and Diaspora social justice, activist, and cyber-feminist advocacy. In 2015, Stephanie successfully transitioned the popular virtual space into a registered nonprofit and has headed the organization for the past 5 years. Her activism largely focuses on sexual and gender bias, violence, reproductive health rights, social policy, and young feminist mentorship. Having worked within the Caribbean context over the past decade, Stephanie brings a wealth of knowledge and expertise to the landscape of women's rights and movement building, grounded in the realities of a diverse region. Welcome, Stephanie. Super happy to have you here today.
Hi, Raquel. It's
How
so
are
good to
you?
be with you again.
Very nice to
well.
see you again and be able to have
Yes.
this chat. I would love to know a lot more about what we started off speaking, and a little bit more about WOMANTRA, if you want to share the process of how it came about.
Sure. This is a story that I have to tell a lot, but I actually like telling this story because, well, I think it's interesting and it's also deeply personal.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a close colleague and friend, Michelle Isava, who is a local performance artist. And many years ago, she did a performance called WOMANTRA, where she was dressed all in white and was drawing 7 concentric circles around herself. And there was a loudspeaker blaring, "The whole is whole." And this performance really resonated with me, kind of speaking to the divine feminine, but also just the wholeness of femininity and womanhood. And this, resonated with me so much so that, I think it was over a year later, I decided to have a centennial celebration for International Women's Day, which was a really kind of quaint gathering of younger and older feminists, sharing poetry, music, even tantric belly dancing. And I named it WOMANTRA. And I remember actually drawing WOMANTRA with sidewalk chalk onto the pavement so that people could find this event,
Mm-hmm.
And following that event, because everybody had such a good time, we were all like, oh, we should keep in touch. We should do this again. And at that time, which was in 2011, Facebook was becoming a thing,
Mm-hmm.
that everybody was on. And so I was like, okay, great. I'll form a group. We can share pictures. We can stay in touch. And from there, it just grew and grew. I started to add other Caribbean feminists that I started to meet through various trainings and meetings in the region. And the rest, as they say, is history.
That's wonderful. But you started as a cyberspace and it became very solid, very well known in the region. And somehow you transitioned into something else in the more recent years. How did that happen?
Well, in 2014, I had the opportunity to study abroad in Portugal. And I was just really nervous, actually, that WOMANTRA would die with me being out of the country. And I just thought now is the time to kind of formalize the collective and figure out leadership, who can run things when I'm gone. And that's when I registered WOMANTRA as a nonprofit organization. And that came just after we had done our first programmatic activity, which was a mentorship program for girls. So we had actually already started to move out of the cyber world and into quote unquote real life. So we were, kind of already starting to do organizational work.
Mm-hmm. And how does the community in Trinidad and Tobago respond to LGBTQ plus community and the work being done by yourself or Mantra and other organized feminist organizations in general? How is the cultural, is there a backlash?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, WOMANTRA, there are a few things that we are most remembered and known for. And one of them was a campaign actually called In Solidarity with Shannon. Um, Shannon Gomes was a young woman who was attempting to go to a club called Aria Nightclub in Trinidad. And it was like a ladies' free night, which we know is kind of common because, the club owners want women in their club. And she was wearing a shirt and pants and like quote unquote male dress shoes. And the club bouncer basically told her that she wasn't allowed to come in for free because she was dressed like a man. And I became aware of this on Facebook. Someone just posted it with an image of like supermodels dressed in what you would consider stereotypically male clothes, um, and looking sexy, and basically just making fun of how ridiculous the whole situation was. And I just became really enraged, just me on my own. I
Mm-hmm.
decided I have to do something about this. And so I, put out a public call for, all women to come dressed as men in front of Aria and have a protest or a solidarity action. And to my surprise, more than I think 30 women showed up. And I think I didn't realize how important that was at the time, because I think this was one of the first, public actions that really centered lesbian women, and specifically the kind of discrimination that women face, even if you're not lesbian, just around
Mm-hmm.
gender identity and all of that. And the media really picked up on this, and it became a thing. I was doing interviews and all of that, specifically talking about gender identity and about transphobia and all of these things that were being attached to Shannon's body. And I think that it was really a kind of turning point where, we were talking about these things on a national scale. Because, of course, conversations were happening around sexual orientation, but those discourses tend to be very male centered, etc., or policy centered. But this was just about you know regular discrimination, like going to a club. And people kind of resonated with people, particularly because there's been similar pushback against clubs in Trinidad around race. So I think
Mm-hmm.
people connected with it in a particular kind of way.
I find it very interesting also that I read a comment you made about how our mantra has really contributed to sort of normalizing feminism and activism and advocacy in Trinidad, which is really an incredible and a huge job.
Yeah,
So
it
good
is.
for you.
But it definitely comes with a lot of pushback
I
and a
know,
lot of backlash.
of
Uh,
course.
so, one of the phrases of the day, um, yeah, in Trinidad is where's WOMANTRA. So people are always asking that question online, whenever there's any type of event that they think a feminist organization should be concerned with, they ask for us right away.
Wow. So the other thing that I wanted to ask about is the process of incorporating art into activism. How do you feel that doing that is different from other types of activism in its effectiveness? Do you feel that our artistic experience allows for a more intimate connection in the process of creating awareness, which is ultimately what you're trying to do?
Yeah. Well, the simple answer is yes. I think it is different in its effectiveness. I think if you really want to connect with people, art naturally has to be at the center, because not everyone um, is going to read legislation or policy or even care about those things. You know,
Mm-hmm.
you have to be able to bring things down to the average person's level, and so that they can understand why this is important to their life. And I think that art is one of those kind of universal languages that can translate really complex ideas and concepts, and make them relevant.
Mm-hmm.
um, I just realized we're not bringing up the pictures. I forgot.
Oh yes.
um, Kyle, but can you go to the third image? So what I would say to answer the second part of the question is that yes, there is a more there's a different dynamic when and an intimate connection, as you said, using art. And for me, that has really been demonstrated through the baby doll character,
Mm-hmm.
because I've been attached to WOMANTRA for so long, it's very hard for me to sometimes separate my own identity from the organization, because a lot of my vision is executed through the organization. But the baby doll has always been a site where I can just be myself.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not representing the organization, and I can really use my own voice to talk about things that are important to me and in the way that I want to tell a story.
Can you tell us a little bit what baby doll is and
Sure.
how it became?
Yes, of course. So the baby doll is what we call a traditional mass character um, that emerged, um, I would assume, well, I don't know really when it would have emerged, but it became popular um, when when we were occupied by American soldiers. They had a base here in Trinidad, and they would have had relationships with local women and then gone away on their ships, but also leaving behind babies. And so the baby doll is a character that is a young girl or a young woman who is pregnant or has a baby or both, and is looking for her child father. And a lot of the babies were white, one, again, because of the reference to American soldiers, but also because there just weren't black babies, right? Even now in 2020, it's hard to find a black doll. Um,
Yes, it is.
so, yeah. And so the baby doll would go on the street, during carnival, and single out men, and ask, basically accuse them of being the baby daddy. So they would, if a man is standing with his wife, she would say, "Oh, you don't remember me? 11 months ago, and you was jumping through my window. You're pretending like you don't remember me because your wife is next to you," you know and really calling out men and demanding that they be responsible for their children, and then also asking for money. So they typically say, "Where the money for the child milk? Don't you know that milk is expensive?"
Mm-hmm.
And so, really, at the heart of the character, um, it is a feminist character, and it's connected to so many feminist issues or woman-centered issues, including responsible fatherhood, teenage pregnancy, etc. And so I just want to talk a little bit about some of the themes I've explored. And the center image that you see there is from a play, Jean and Dinah, which is a Tony Hall play who recently passed. But Jean and Dinah are very iconic characters in the Trinidad landscape. They were known prostitutes and also best friends. And so I had the pleasure of playing Jean in Jean and Dinah. And the character, the baby doll character, was used for Jean to actually talk about her sexual assault, which probably happened when she was a girl, And I think that the character does that really well. It can transform you and take you into a different headspace, and really explore things that are difficult to do, but using a familiar and traditional art form to connect with a local audience.
I also think it's fascinating how carnival and cultural experiences like that allow for a safe space for this kind of performative things to develop and feel okay and allow people to relate in a very direct way.
Exactly. So one year I actually played a lesbian baby doll. So that's one of the ways that I use my activism to push back against, heteronormativity. And as you said, inhabit a safe space to push boundaries. So my character's name was Leslie. So I was Leslie, the lesbian doll. And I was, instead of looking for my child father, I was looking for my child mother, who was Nikki, who had left me because, she couldn't deal with the stigma and discrimination from being with a woman. And it was really interesting because I got to explore, complex themes like what really makes a family. Like, is it just biology, or are there other ways in which we can envision family?
Absolutely. And also it's such a sensitive subject, and I think that everybody can relate to it, particularly in the Caribbean, where even right now in the Dominican Republic, as we speak, we are in Congress trying to figure out if it's okay to have a childhood marriage. So, I mean, it's a thing that is being discussed.
Yeah, well, only very recently was child marriage outlawed in Trinidad, so Trinidad and Tobago. So it is an ongoing conversation, but I feel confident that that all countries will make the right decision.
I hope so.
Yeah.
There's also a few other performative projects that you've had, Silent Silhouettes and Black Lives Matter. Do you want to talk a little bit about those two?
Absolutely. Well, let's get the picture up, Kyle. Kyle is our tech support. Well, Silent Silhouettes is one of my earliest projects that I started in, I believe, 2008. So I would have been introduced to the project through a workshop. And its original name was Silent Witnesses. And so when I came back to Trinidad, I thought, how can I rethink this a little bit and make it my own? But basically, Silent Silhouettes is a moving installation that documents femicide. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the term, femicide is the murder of women and girls based on their gender identity. So because they are women and girls and the power dynamics that inherently means in a patriarchal society. So in the center there, you see Michelle Isava. I had mentioned her earlier, who did the performance WOMANTRA. So this is her again. So you can see she's one of our loyal supporters. Is surrounded by the silhouettes, and she has flowers in her hand. So the very first year that we did this installation, In addition to the installation, there was a performance where she delivered these flowers to each of the silhouettes, which was supposed to represent, the love that existed in those relationships. But at the end, they're torn and broken and kind of wrapped around the necks of the women. So from very early on, in addition to the visual representation of the silhouette itself, we did want to add another dimension that really, captured the just emotions of grief and terror that accompanies the murder of women, but murder of anyone in general, because we become desensitized to these things in the media, because every day there's reports of murder. And so that's one of the reasons why we do this installation every year, is to be a solemn reminder that this is happening. These were real women and that their lives mattered.
And it's a huge difference in the sense of getting desensitized. I think it's very different to read something in the press than to actually experience it in the physical space. And that's where I feel that it's so potent, that
Exactly.
you are using performance and incorporating these images in the landscape as a reminder.
Yeah. So you can see all of them in the top right, that they're in a line. And it's really, as you said, an important visual, because the installation is statistically accurate. So WOMANTRA collects the statistics from the police, as well as from journalists, so that we can create a story of each woman. And then we make the number of silhouettes, based on the number of women and girls that were killed. So as of November, that number was 18, and it's more now. But we use the details that we gather from journalists also to create graphic campaigns. So in the top left, you can see there's a woman in pink, and you can't really see the text behind her, but those are the actual details of her story. So we have, over the years, we've been thinking through, what is the ethical implications around keeping these women's identities, well, not private because it's already in the public domain, but not necessarily including it in our installation. So in earlier years, you can see that our silhouette was very generic. There's a design on it, but it's generic, and we used it for each woman. But now, you see, we've moved into more human-like forms. And each image actually is supposed to be is supposed to resemble the actual woman. So based on the details that we have from the news reports, we're now trying to create the likeness as close as we possibly can.
And when these performances happen, do you invite people to come over? Do people just show up while it's happening? How does it work?
Right. So typically the installation happens in a public space, like a park or something like that, where there's a lot of traffic. And so there may be some promotion online, but really it's about getting off of the online space and just going in a public area for whoever passes by. And that has gone really well for us, because a lot of people stop and they want to talk with us. They want to debrief. Some of them can identify the woman based on her story, and they typically ask for resources. So we really use it as an opportunity to raise awareness, but to also do outreach. But this year, we received funding to do an installation, but of course that couldn't happen because of COVID-19. So we decided to make a short film. And,
wonderful.
Yeah, and that was a really big success, because people obviously could not visit the installation, but we still did it. We captured it in the film, but the film was so much more than the installation. Even though it brought the installation to life in a way that we hadn't before. and we were able to use this perfect song by a local artist, Sheldon Blackman, which pulled at everybody's heartstrings. By the time the movie ended, everybody was crying.
Wow. Do you have a link for that? That would be wonderful to share.
Yes, of course. You can find it on our Facebook page, as well as our YouTube channel. It's
Okay.
called Silent Silhouettes.
Okay.
Simple title.
Perfect. Perfect.
Yeah,
And
and it's
what do Black Lives Matter? Because I know that you went into that kind of activism that was so prevalent this year all over the world. How
yeah,
did that happen?
girl, it was a journey. But can we have the next image? Yes, thank you, Kyle. So some folks who we knew had Black Lives Matter, action, solidarity action in front of the American embassy, and WOMANTRA decided to go. But it seemed to be kind of centered on the American situation with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and stuff. But we felt that it was important for us to talk about our own experiences. So, members of my team at WOMANTRA started to do research about extrajudicial killings here. And, we started to document the names of all of the people that the police had killed. And we took those to the protest. And so I think we were already kind of in that headspace, when just a few days later, the police murdered 3 men from a community called Mova, which you can see there in the images. And the authorities were again trying to feed us the narrative that these criminal elements were shooting at them and they were just retaliating. But on this particular occasion, we had evidence that that was a lie because there was CCTV camera footage as well as footage from one of the neighbors. And so there was, obviously public outrage, and that led to 3 days of protests in Trinidad and Tobago. And I really want to talk about, all of these images because I think all of them were so important in different ways. So when this initially happened, a local artist, graphic artist, well, he's multimedia artist, Darren Chiwa, made the first graphic, which is Mova Black Lives Matter. And as you can see, the TT is in red for Trinidad and Tobago. And I saw this image online and I was like, this is really powerful. We should do more of these. And little did I know how important that was going to be, because when these protests started happening, members of our team at WOMANTRA it felt like we were awake for the entire 3 days, just, listening to the news, watching all of the lives, and listening to what the politicians had to say and stuff. And we actually started to map all of the places where the protests were happening. And so we asked Darren if he could make more of these images to represent all of the places where protests were happening. And that became very important because, the Commissioner of Police, as well as the Minister of National Security, was saying that, this was organized by, some gang members who were paying people to protest in an attempt to destabilize the country. That was the narrative being pushed. And we were able to show through this exercise of mapping all of the areas where it was happening that was a lie. And it represents a really important counter narrative to what the state was saying, because there were protests happening all the way in South Trinidad, in Central Trinidad, in North Trinidad, So that was one thing that we did. And these important collaborations are important, and not just the collaborations, but also being able to see a moment or an opportunity and really build.
Exactly. And not only that, but this can be a worldwide project, because this is an image that can be transferable to every country in the world with different names, and it will work. Yeah. So just putting that into perspective, it's really powerful.
Yeah. So another thing that we did is, you can see a living right there in one of the images. And these were apparently some of the last words of Joel Jacobs, which was one of the 3 men gunned down by the police in Mova. And why this was particularly heartbreaking was because it was his birthday. And he was just with a couple of his friends, and they were about to go down on the main road to buy some rum to celebrate his birthday. And he literally lived right there. He was just a few steps away from his home. And so we really wanted to capture that. Like, you can just literally be outside of your home and be gunned down by the police. Which was also the case of Ornella Graves, who you can see in another image there. So all of these images in the center, the brown ones, you can see say 1 month. So this was after, the 3 men were killed. So you can see their 3 names on, well, you probably can't see, on the placards in the first one. In the middle one, it says 1 month since the 3-day uprisings. And what we did here is we actually realized that these protests started happening on the birthday of Kwame Ture. And for our audience, or those who aren't familiar, Kwame Ture is a Trinidadian, or was a Trinidadian Black revolutionary and head of the Black Panther Party, and is really important to us as decolonial feminists and Trinidadian feminists. And we thought that this is too poetic. We have to make these connections. And again, it was really important for us to find ways to really ground this movement in our own context, because there's so much media attention and just global attention to the American Black Lives Matter movement, but this is really a global movement, and we have to reinforce at every point that we can that Black people are being oppressed all around the world, regardless if it's a Black majority country, if it's a Black government, it really doesn't matter,
Yeah, absolutely. And
yeah.
No, and that brings me to another question about how, in your experience, has feminism evolved from a more Western and perhaps dogmatic way that we all know from the past to a more inclusive, transmutable energy that can fit into our post-colonial Caribbean reality and the challenges that we face now?
Yeah. Well, I think young people are really leading the way. When I look at younger feminists who are 18, 19, 20, they really are quite radical, and it makes my heart smile. And I think that they know what it's about. They are they're not trapped by the same kind of respectability and ideas about, or disillusioned as much as older generations. Sorry, my earbud fell out. Give me 1 second.
Sure.
I think it's missing, but I can still hear you, so that's what's important. But yeah, and so I think that being around younger feminists has been really important for me and has been a major part of my work, because they push me in my own boundaries. So even when people in my own organization are telling me, oh, well, that's not how we should do this, we should think about this differently, I always thank them, even if I don't agree, and even if it irritates me. I still thank them, because they really force me to think about things in different ways and to be accountable. So I think that Caribbean feminism has really proven itself to be diverse and decolonial, and making space for different types of identities and realities. We have an Indo-feminist movement here in the Caribbean. We have a certain type of respect and acknowledgement of Indigenous contributions. So it's very intersectional. And I think also we have to acknowledge our foremothers, who were really some of the first women to be talking about intersectionality, even if they didn't use that word.
Mm-hmm.
So we have Claudia Jones, who was a very well-known feminist Marxist from Trinidad and Tobago, who was talking about triple oppression, race, gender, and class. And then we
Mm-hmm.
have the diaspora feminist Audre Lorde, Grenadian
Mm-hmm.
and Barbadian, who was, talking about intersectionality as well in um, in ways that really resonate with Black and Caribbean feminists
Mm-hmm.
even now and all over the world.
Yeah, and I think that's the beauty of finding our own strength in being smaller, in being a community as we are in the Caribbean, because it allows for that. We need to connect to other um, activists and play together and express our thoughts together and make our political movements together, because that's sort of like the holistic way of putting out our views and empowering each other. So I think that's an asset that we have and we need to embrace.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. But I have another question about. It struck me when you talked about how earlier that people keep calling you for backup and for advice and just reporting certain things, and I just wanted to know how you feel, because we come from countries where not trusting our authorities has become the norm. And we have to kind of rely on institutions like you to give us a sense of security. So
Yeah.
we feel vulnerable, insecure, and how do you manage that from WOMANTRA to respond to the increasing reliance of people in your platform as a mechanism to report violence and abuse?
Yeah. I think maybe a few years ago, Omantra started to do kind of informal referrals because women or people in general would reach out to us, regularly to ask um, about LGBT friendly doctors, or how can I access abortion, or how can I get psychosocial support. Um, and I think, we felt that sense of responsibility of having to become more formalized in kind of support that we give to our constituency. And so I'm happy to announce that in the new year, WOMANTRA will in fact be opening its doors for a legal clinic, which will be supporting victims of gender-based violence. Um, and so, you know, women and men can access free advice and representation, if they meet a certain criteria. Um, but I think, as you said, that people have come to rely on us in a particular type of way is really interesting, and it is representative of the failure of the state. Um, and NGOs really need to be supported because they are offering services that the government can't for whatever reason. Um, and, I think this whole phenomenon about asking where's WOMANTRA is really just a kind of national pride that they literally have no faith that the government or the state is going to do what it's supposed to do, because it's really not, it doesn't really make sense to call on an NGO when a woman is killed. Like, how are we supposed to prevent murder? We do what we can, but we are not the police. We're not investigators.
Right.
Um, so it's a very interesting situation, but we appreciate that we're in a unique position that people look to us for advice and for support, and so we're happy to fill that gap to the best of our ability.
And do police find that you are an
Can you just please repeat that, Raquel?
Yes, I'm asking if the police or the authorities in Trinidad, do they consider you to be an ally in terms of the support that you give to the community? I mean, do you ever find yourself in the situation of getting a phone call that you need to forward to them, and how do they respond to that?
Yeah, well, it's mixed reviews. I think that the police is happy, when you're praising them, and when you're not praising them, it's, a different story.
Yep.
But WOMANTRA is fiercely committed to holding state institutions accountable, and we are accountable to our constituents, to our members, and to women. I mean, we're WOMANTRA.
Exactly.
So our our commitment and our loyalty is always going to be to women, and to girls. And so I think that the relationship is kind of touch and go, and that's why they need to have proper formalized mechanisms in place, so that it's not just like, oh well, I don't like what WOMANTRA said today, so therefore we're not going to give them information tomorrow. There needs to be a proper structured way, in which NGOs and state institutions, not just the police, but all state institutions, can share information and have partnerships. Even if you don't consider them an ally, the point is we have common ground, and we're working towards the same aims, which should make us allies. But these relationships are complicated and require negotiation.
I can imagine. All right, so I wonder if there are, because I believe we're in that time where we can start receiving questions from the public. So are there any questions that maybe Stephanie can answer? Annalie is asking, thanks for sharing, Stephanie. Under COVID, violence against women has risen exponentially. How has it impacted WOMANTRA's work?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it has caused gender-based violence to rise exponentially. And so part of what we did is to create a survivor handbook, which is, if I might say so myself, really one of the most impressive survivor guides that I've seen, because it's so comprehensive. It outlines all of the resources that are available for victims of gender-based violence. So not just the hotline numbers, but also organizations that offer support, the specific types of police units that exist, how you can get in touch with them, but also the COVID-19 measures introduced by the court, for example. So now you can get an emergency protection order that a magistrate can prepare for you. There's a special hotline number for the courts, etc. We also offered information in Spanish for the migrant community, because we have a large Venezuelan migrant community here now in Trinidad, so that they can also access these things, because we've seen at least 4 women, I think Cuban and Venezuelan women, being murdered within the past year. But also a specific rights section. So how can people navigate the legal system, particularly when dealing with police? So telling people they have a right to be accompanied at the police station, for example, because, a victim can obviously be traumatized after an incident of violence and want somebody to go with them, and oftentimes the police might be dismissive about that. So you have a right to be accompanied, or you have a right to a receipt. So, for example, a lot of times when people go to make a report, it's not taken because the police say, oh, well, we don't have any receipt books. That's not an excuse. They can write receipts on a regular piece of paper and just stamp it, for example. And I think that the police has been able to get away with a lot of things because people don't know what their rights are. And so that was a major part of the job of the handbook, is to inform people of their rights, but also to inform people about the law, So it also included, we also did a virtual campaign actually about the domestic violence amendments. So the Domestic Violence Act was amended in June. And so we wanted to bring rights to the people, let people know what these rights are, again, because who reads the law? And we don't really have a rights-centered or educated public. And so I think that has become a major part of WOMANTRA's work, is breaking down the law in ways that people can understand, and again, that is relevant to their lives. Because there's a lot of stuff in there that's really important. Like, for example, now with the new amendments, there's no cap on the amount that a woman can be awarded. So before it was like $15,000, and now there's no cap. It's within the judgment of the magistrate or judge. And these things are important for people to know. And especially if the judiciary is not, fully on top of the law, and this happens, they might still be working on all understandings of the law. And so it's really important for our citizenry to know and understand their rights.
Great.
Oh, and as I mentioned, the legal clinic, which will be opening in January. So, and it will be available virtually. So we're really hoping that can offer some relief to victims at this time.
Okay. I think we have two more questions. Midas is asking, how do you transition between theater, art installation, activism, and the digital space? Do you find the shifting difficulty, or is it energizing?
It's definitely energizing. I don't find transitioning between different methodologies and approaches difficult. I've always been that way. Since I was a child, I was involved in dance and theater. And so those things I just carried with me. They don't really seem like they're separate things. And, Raquel, we had talked, in our initial conversation a little bit about that, like how artists see themselves as artists and how activists see themselves as activists, and how seeing yourself as both is really difficult. So even though I don't refer to myself as an artist, I am aware and I appreciate and value how much art is at the center of my activism. And it feels very natural to me, particularly because my main, I suppose, point of reference or practice is writing. So yeah, inherently that's its own art form.
Wow. I did not know that. And we've been speaking quite a bit. That's great. That kind of puts it all together. Wonderful. Is there another question?
I think there is.
BIM Vibes, as a hub for Caribbean and Diaspora social justice activists, can you talk about WOMANTRA's regional reach? Do you connect with the Anglophone region or also the Spanish, French, and Dutch Caribbean?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, yeah, even though WOMANTRA is based in Trinidad, I have always seen it as being an important link for feminists and social justice activists in the region. And I have done collaborative work with individuals and organizations within the Anglophone Caribbean, connecting with Spanish, French, and Dutch speakers is always more difficult because of, obviously the language barrier. Unfortunately, I don't speak any other language fluently enough. And I think it is fundamentally one of the major barriers for meaningful solidarity and partnership in the region, is the fact that we are so disparate, not only with geography and of course inflated prices to even fly anywhere, but also through language. So my partnership has been limited, but there is some. So for example, WOMANTRA is part of a project called Frontline Alliance, Caribbean Partnership to End Gender-Based Violence, which is being led by Outright Action International. And One of the countries within our partnership is Haiti. And so we have some partnerships there. And back in 2015, I think it is, WOMANTRA would have co-hosted the Caribbean Women's Sexuality and Diversity Conference, which is put on by ECADE. But at that time, it was United and Strong. And that was the first CWSDC where we actually had Spanish speakers and also Spanish translators. And so I would have been the one to organize the translation. So I guess the simple answer is yes. I try to, make connections when I can, but it is difficult. Yes.
Do you find that, like, for example, Spanish-speaking islands connect more to the Latin American region, and maybe other islands that speak English or Dutch connect more to the continent, as opposed to the Caribbean itself working together?
Yeah, definitely. I can't really say I know too much about Cuba and what Cuba is doing in terms of their feminist movement. But definitely the DR is heavily aligned with the Latin American countries, which makes sense. Haiti seems to be a kind of prominent figure in terms of the funding landscape and the feminist advocacy landscape. Like, these IOs are always trying to include Haiti, and I suppose that's for many reasons, but one, of course, being their economic status. But I always wonder, like, what's going on with the other francophone islands, and I always tell funders that, like, are there no feminists in Martinique, in Guadeloupe? Like, how are we making a larger effort to include those islands? And so I guess that my advocacy is basically at that level. And I have some say somewhere because I am an advisor to the Equality Fund, who is currently doing a Caribbean project called Women's Voice in Leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I think the Dutch islands also are probably more in conversation with each other than they are with the Anglophone Caribbean. One exception being Saint Martin. I think Saint Martin is the most kind of integrated with the rest of us, and perhaps that's because a lot of people in Saint Martin speak English, and also it's a highly multi-ethnic country. But maybe those aren't the reasons at all. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I have one last question. What would your advice be to not only younger feminists in the Caribbean region, but also people who are being interdisciplinary in their approach to communication through art, activism, writing, etc.?
Yeah, my message. This is another common question. Feel pressured. But I guess for me, if I had to, give a message to younger feminists, it would be to, never be afraid of the power of your own voice. There'll be a lot of naysayers or people who just don't have the same ideas or priorities as you. But your voice, your point of view is important, even if it's only important to you, and that matters. But I assure you, you'll always find commonalities. And so don't be afraid to share your voice. But also, equally as important is to always question your own positionality. None of us have reached, none of us have made it. Our life is a lifelong learning experience, and you have to always leave space for getting it wrong, for learning, for unlearning. And if you really value other people's voice, you will spend as much time listening as you will talking. Yeah, and also just that, to be a radical, to identify as a feminist is not an easy thing to do. It's not an easy road. It's not, a popularity contest or red roses. It's really hard and grueling work. And,
Yeah.
you have to be ready to commit to that more or less for the rest of your life. because I don't see the patriarchy falling anytime soon.
Yes.
So yeah,
You know,
it's a marathon.
it's very interesting that recently I was at a meeting and they were debating whether feminism was the right term today, that maybe gender equality was more fitting with the times. And I just had such a big issue with that.
Yeah.
Because I would love to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, well, I mean, gender equality is obviously the more palatable term. I think a lot of the the discourse around development is um, decided by and articulated by development agencies like the UN, like the IDB, etc. And so gender equality has become the kind of acceptable term to talk about equality between men and women. But that's not what feminism is talking about. Feminism isn't talking about equality. Feminism is
Mm-hmm.
talking about, radical freedom and liberation and, destruction of gender as we know it. So that's not really a message that is easily digestible. And so, yeah, I think gender equality is the kind of middle road that people have decided
More
is
comfortable.
is reasonable. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I guess we have reached the end of our conversation because we are close to 2 o'clock. But I just want to say that this has been super honor for me to get to know what you do. As I told you, I come from a family of activists, and even though my approach, as you were speaking earlier, is kind of like the opposite from you. Like I work through art, but there's some activism there, but I mostly focus on the artwork. But I completely relate and feel because I was raised knowing how much effort it really takes to do what you do and to make the changes that you do. And I always admire that profoundly. So I want to really, really thank you for the work that you do and for this conversation today.
Thank you to you as well, Raquel. It's been a real pleasure. This conversation has been really easy. And as I said, I think they chose to put us together for a reason. And the work you do is also amazing. So it's also been an honor for me.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephanie. I would like to please remind you to tune in today again at 4 p.m. For my discussion with Puerto Rican-based artist Awilda Rodriguez Lora. In closing today's salon, I'd like to express huge thanks to the Catapult partners, including the American Friends of Jamaica, Kingston Creative, and Fresh Milk for making this series of salons happen. Thank you all. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you all. Hello.